Ryan Caldwell lifted his champagne and laughed loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. Remember Olivia? She was nothing without me. A few people chuckled. Olivia Bennet stood frozen beneath the crystal chandeliers, humiliation burning in her chest. Then the room suddenly went quiet. A tall man in a black suit walked through the crowd like he owned the air. Everyone breathed. Sebastian Cole, billionaire, investor, legend. He stopped in front of Olivia, reached into his pocket, and dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled across the room as he opened a velvet ring box. Ryan's smile vanished, and Olivia realized everyone was staring at her answer. The cruelest lie a person can hear is that they are nothing without someone else. The chandeliers above the Grand Regency ballroom shimmered like frozen stars, scattering gold light across polished marble floors and tables lined with crystal glasses. The air carried the soft hum of expensive conversations, the faint scent of sandalwood cologne and champagne drifting through the crowd of New York's most polished elite. Olivia Bennet stood near the edge of the room, her fingers lightly wrapped around a glass of sparkling water she hadn't tasted. 3 years ago, she had stood in rooms like this beside Ryan Caldwell as his wife, smiling politely while investors praised his ambition. Tonight she stood alone, dressed in a simple emerald gown that caught the light just enough to remind people she was still there. She hadn't planned to see him. Not tonight. Not in a room filled with people who remembered the old version of her. Then she heard the laugh. Ryan's laugh had always carried across a room like it owned the air around it. Olivia felt it before she saw him. He stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by colleagues and friends, a champagne flute raised casually in his hand. At his side stood his new fiancée, tall and radiant in a silver dress that glittered beneath the chandeliers. Ryan looked exactly the same as he had the day their divorce papers were finalized. Confident, polished, untouchable. For a moment Olivia considered slipping quietly toward the exit. The elevator was less than 30 feet away across the marble floor. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Ryan's eyes swept the room and stopped. Right on her. The smile that spread across his face was not warm. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he believes he has already won. Conversations nearby began to quiet as he stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing softly against the floor. Well, look who decided to show up, he said, loud enough for the people around him to hear. Several heads turned. Olivia felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the same one she used to feel during the final year of their marriage when every word from him carried a hidden edge. Ryan tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were a curiosity. Remember Olivia? He said to the small crowd forming around them. She used to be my wife. A few awkward chuckles drifted through the air. Then Ryan lifted his glass and added with a careless shrug, Truth is, she was nothing without me. The words hung in the ballroom like smoke. Olivia felt the sting instantly, but she didn't look away. 3 years ago she might have lowered her eyes. 3 years ago she might have believed him. But tonight she simply stood there, quiet, steady, the emerald fabric of her dress catching the warm chandelier light. Somewhere across the room, unnoticed by almost everyone, a tall man in a dark tailored suit had paused near the entrance. His gaze rested on Olivia with quiet focus, as if he had been searching for her the entire evening. And while Ryan Caldwell enjoyed the echo of his own laughter, he had no idea that the most powerful man in the room had just started walking directly toward the woman he had called nothing. The laughter around Ryan Caldwell faded slowly, but the weight of his words remained suspended in the air like dust caught in chandelier light. Olivia Bennet felt every pair of eyes resting on her, waiting for the reaction they expected. 3 years ago, she would have felt small under that attention. 3 years ago, she might have apologized for simply existing in the same room. But tonight she did not move. She did not lower her gaze. Instead, she took a slow breath, the cool scent of polished marble and champagne filling her lungs as she met Ryan's eyes with a calm that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Ryan studied her face, searching for the familiar crack in her composure, the quiet insecurity he used to exploit so easily. He had built entire arguments during their marriage around that weakness, turning her doubts into proof that she needed him. But something about her tonight felt different. There was a steadiness in her posture, a quiet strength in the way she held her shoulders that did not belong to the woman he remembered. Olivia gave a small nod, as if acknowledging his words without accepting them. Around them, the ballroom slowly returned to its soft murmur of conversation, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud that had not fully passed. Ryan's fiancée shifted beside him, her silver gown catching the light as she glanced curiously between them. She had heard enough about the former wife to know the story Ryan liked to tell. In that version, Olivia had been timid, unambitious, someone who could not keep up with the speed of his success. It was a narrative Ryan repeated often because it made his own choices sound justified. Olivia had heard that version too, through whispers and carefully worded sympathy from people who had once attended their dinner parties. What those people never understood was how quietly a person could rebuild their life when no one was watching. The truth was that the night Olivia left Ryan's penthouse apartment 3 years earlier, she had felt as though the entire world had been erased beneath her feet. She had walked through the cold Manhattan air carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the echo of his final words telling her she would never survive without him. For weeks afterward, she had almost believed it. She had moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, where the radiator rattled in the winter and the view overlooked a narrow brick alley instead of a skyline. She had taken a quiet consulting job with a nonprofit investment group that specialized in protecting small businesses from financial fraud. The salary was modest by Manhattan standards, but the work gave her something Ryan never had, respect that was not tied to his name. And that was where everything had quietly begun to change. 6 months into that new job, Olivia had noticed irregularities in a proposed investment deal crossing her desk. The paperwork was subtle, designed to look legitimate unless someone read every detail with patience. Most people would have signed off on it without question. Olivia did not. Her careful report stopped a multi-million-dollar acquisition that would have collapsed within months. At the time, she did not realize that one of the silent partners behind that deal was a man whose reputation moved quietly through the financial world like a shadow. Sebastian Cole. Tonight, across the vast ballroom, that same man continued walking through the crowd toward her with calm, deliberate steps. Conversations softened as people noticed him. Heads turned. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the entire room recognized that someone powerful had just entered the center of its gravity. Olivia had not yet seen him approaching, but Ryan Caldwell certainly had not either. And if Ryan had known what was about to unfold in the next few moments, he might have thought twice before raising that champagne glass. The shift in the room happened quietly at first, like the subtle change in air before a storm arrives. Conversations softened one by one as people noticed the tall man moving through the crowd with calm confidence. Sebastian Cole did not hurry. He did not need to. In a room filled with powerful executives and wealthy investors, his presence carried a different kind of gravity. Olivia Bennett still had not turned around. She remained standing across from Ryan Caldwell, her posture calm, her expression composed in a way that Ryan found increasingly unsettling. The silence that followed his earlier remark had not turned into the humiliation he expected. Instead, it felt as though the moment had paused, waiting for something neither of them fully understood. Ryan cleared his throat and took another sip of champagne, forcing a light laugh as he glanced at the people around him. "Well," he said with a casual shrug, "I suppose everyone deserves a second chance to attend a decent party." A few polite smiles flickered around the circle, but the attention of several guests had already drifted past him toward the man approaching from behind. The subtle ripple of recognition spread quickly through the ballroom. Someone whispered a name near the back of the crowd. Another person turned sharply, their eyes widening with surprise. Ryan frowned slightly as the energy in the room shifted away from him. He followed the direction of several gazes and finally noticed the figure stepping into the open space beside Olivia. Sebastian Cole stopped a few feet from her, his dark suit tailored with quiet precision, his expression calm, yet focused. For a brief moment, he simply looked at her, as though confirming that the woman he had been searching for was truly standing there. Olivia turned then, sensing the sudden change in the room's atmosphere. The moment her eyes met his, recognition flickered across her face. It had been almost 2 years since their last meeting in a quiet conference room overlooking the Hudson River, where she had presented the report that protected his investment group from a devastating financial trap. Back then he had thanked her with a handshake and a promise that careful people like her were rare. She had never expected to see him again. Around them, the murmuring crowd fell almost completely silent. Ryan's confusion deepened as he watched the exchange. He knew the name Sebastian Cole, of course. Anyone in New York finance knew it. But the idea that the most private billionaire investor in the city would stop directly in front of his former wife felt impossible. Sebastian's voice, when he spoke, was calm and steady, carrying easily through the quiet ballroom. "Olivia Bennett," he said warmly. "It has been a long time." Olivia nodded slightly, still processing the sudden appearance. "Yes," she replied softly. "Longer than I expected." Sebastian glanced briefly toward Ryan and the half-circle of onlookers before returning his attention to Olivia. There was something deliberate in the way he stood there, as though the entire room had become irrelevant except for the woman in front of him. Ryan lowered his champagne glass slowly, his earlier confidence fading into uncertainty. He had expected embarrassment. He had expected silence. What he had not expected was for the most influential investor in the room to walk directly past him without acknowledgement. Sebastian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, his expression thoughtful as he looked at Olivia with quiet admiration. The small velvet box in his hand caught the chandelier light as he opened it. A collective gasp moved through the ballroom like a wave. Ryan Caldwell stood frozen, the glass slipping slightly in his fingers, as Sebastian Cole lowered himself onto one knee in front of the woman Ryan had just called nothing. For a moment, the entire ballroom forgot how to breathe. The glittering chandeliers above seemed frozen in time, their golden light reflecting off crystal glasses and polished marble, while every eye locked onto the impossible scene unfolding in the center of the room. Sebastian Cole, the quiet billionaire whose presence alone could shift markets, remained calmly on one knee before Olivia Bennett. The small velvet box rested open in his hand, revealing a diamond that caught the light like a star captured in glass. Olivia stood motionless, her heart beating so loudly she wondered if the people around her could hear it. Just minutes ago, she had been standing alone under the weight of Ryan Caldwell's words, the echo of his voice telling the room that she had been nothing without him. And now the most powerful man in the ballroom was looking at her, as though she were the only person who existed. Sebastian's voice broke the silence, warm and steady, carrying easily through the quiet crowd. 2 years ago, you stopped me from making the worst investment decision of my life, he said softly. You did it without asking for recognition, without asking for anything at all. Olivia blinked in surprise, remembering that quiet afternoon when she had handed him a report filled with numbers and warnings that no one else had noticed. At the time, she thought it had been just another consulting job. But Sebastian had remembered every detail. He continued, his eyes never leaving hers. Most people in this room know me as a man who studies risk and profit. But what I saw that day was something far more rare. Integrity, intelligence, and courage. The murmurs in the ballroom grew louder as guests leaned closer, sensing they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years. Ryan Caldwell stood frozen a few feet away, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand as the reality of the situation slowly settled in. The woman he had just mocked in front of his colleagues was now the center of attention for a reason he could never have predicted. Sebastian lifted the velvet box slightly, the diamond catching the chandelier light again as he spoke with quiet sincerity. Olivia Bennett, you rebuilt your life when the world expected you to disappear. You chose dignity when bitterness would have been easier. His words carried through the silent ballroom like a promise. And somewhere along the way I realized something else. The woman who walked into my office 2 years ago with a simple report changed more than just a business decision. She changed the direction of my life. Olivia felt her breath catch in her chest as the crowd leaned closer, waiting. Sebastian's expression softened into a rare smile. So tonight, I will ask you something in front of everyone here. He drew a slow breath before speaking again, his voice calm, yet filled with unmistakable emotion. Olivia Bennett, will you marry me? The question seemed to ripple across the ballroom like a wave of electricity. Gasps and whispers spread instantly through the crowd as people turned to one another in disbelief. Ryan Caldwell's confident smile had completely vanished now, replaced by stunned silence as the reality of the moment unfolded before him. The same room where he had tried to diminish Olivia just minutes earlier was now watching her, as though she were the most important person in the building. Olivia looked down at Sebastian, her mind racing through memories of the past 3 years, the quiet apartment on the Upper West Side, the the late nights rebuilding her career, the long journey back to believing in herself again. And standing there beneath the shimmering chandeliers, she realized that the life she had rebuilt in silence had just become the center of the most extraordinary moment in the room. The silence that followed Sebastian Cole's question felt almost sacred, as if the entire ballroom had become a cathedral built from crystal and light. Olivia Bennet stood beneath the shimmering chandeliers with hundreds of eyes fixed on her, yet the only thing she could truly see was the man kneeling in front of her. For a moment the world around her faded into a soft blur of polished marble, velvet gowns, and stunned whispers. Her mind drifted backward through the long road that had brought her here. She remembered the cold night 3 years earlier when she stepped out of Ryan Caldwell's penthouse carrying a single suitcase and a heart full of doubt. She remembered the quiet Upper West Side apartment with its rattling radiator and narrow alley view. The late nights spent rebuilding a life that no longer depended on anyone else's approval. She remembered the first time she had walked into Sebastian Cole's office, nervous yet determined, holding a report that everyone else had overlooked. Back then she had believed she was simply doing her job. She had never imagined that moment would lead to this one. Around her the murmurs of the crowd continued to ripple through the ballroom like waves across glass. People leaned toward one another, whispering in disbelief, some smiling, others staring as though they were witnessing a scene from a film rather than real life. A few feet away Ryan Caldwell remained perfectly still, the confident expression he wore earlier now replaced by something far less certain. The champagne glass in his hand trembled slightly as he watched the woman he once dismissed become the center of a moment he could never control. Olivia drew a slow breath, feeling the cool air brush her skin as the emerald fabric of her dress caught the chandelier light. Her heart was still racing, but beneath the surprise there was a deep calm rising within her. The calm of someone who had already survived the hardest chapter of her story. She looked down at Sebastian again. His expression held no pressure, no expectation, only quiet respect. He had offered his question openly, but the choice was entirely hers. That realization meant more to her than the diamond rings sparkling in the velvet box. For years she had been told that her value depended on someone else's success, someone else's approval. Standing here now, she understood how wrong that belief had been. Olivia slowly knelt so that she was level with Sebastian, her voice soft but steady as it carried through the quiet ballroom. For a long time, she said, I believed the things people told me about who I was supposed to be. The room remained silent as every guest listened carefully. But the truth is that losing everything forced me to discover something far more important. She paused briefly, her eyes meeting Sebastian's. It forced me to discover who I really am. A gentle smile touched her face as she glanced at the ring and then back at him. And the person I became along the way is not someone who needs to be rescued. Sebastian's smile deepened with quiet understanding. Olivia's voice softened further, warm and certain. But she is someone who knows the difference between respect and pride. She reached out slowly and placed her hand in his. Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you. The response moved through the ballroom like a wave of electricity. Gasps turned into applause, and the elegant room that had moments ago echoed with disbelief now filled with the bright sound of celebration. Yet across the polished floor Ryan Caldwell stood frozen in place, watching as the woman he once called nothing rose beside the man who had just asked her to share a future far greater than the past she had left behind. The applause rolled through the Grand Regency ballroom like a rising tide, bright and electric beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Olivia Bennet felt the warmth of Sebastian Cole's hand as he gently slipped the diamond ring onto her finger, the stone catching the golden light and scattering it across the polished marble floor. For a moment the noise of the room faded into a distant hum as she looked at the ring, still trying to process the surreal turn the evening had taken. Just minutes ago she had been standing quietly at the edge of the room, absorbing the echo of Ryan Caldwell's words. Now the same crowd that once admired Ryan was applauding her. Sebastian rose slowly to his feet, his calm presence steady beside her as the room continued to buzz with excitement. Some guests lifted their glasses in celebration, while others leaned together whispering in amazement. The story would travel through every corner of Manhattan by morning. But Sebastian did not look at the crowd. His attention remained on Olivia with quiet admiration, as though the reaction around them was simply background noise. "You handled that moment with more grace than most people could imagine," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Olivia smiled gently, still slightly overwhelmed. "Life has a way of teaching you patience," she replied. Across the ballroom, Ryan Caldwell finally set his champagne glass down on a nearby table, though his hand lingered there for a moment as he tried to regain his composure. The confident atmosphere he had enjoyed earlier had vanished completely. Guests who had been laughing with him only minutes before were now turning their attention toward Olivia and Sebastian, leaving Ryan standing in an uncomfortable pocket of silence. His fiancée shifted uneasily beside him, glancing at the ring on Olivia's finger and then back at Ryan with an expression that held more questions than admiration. Ryan cleared his throat and attempted a small smile, but the gesture felt hollow. He had built his reputation on control and image, on being the man who always held the advantage. Tonight that image had quietly slipped through his fingers. Olivia noticed the tension across the room, but chose not to linger on it. For the first time in years, she felt completely free of the past that had once defined her. She turned back to Sebastian as the music from the ballroom orchestra slowly resumed, the gentle notes of a piano drifting through the air like a calm breeze after a storm. Guests began to return to their tables, though many continued to glance toward the couple with curiosity and admiration. Sebastian offered Olivia his arm with a warm smile. "May I have the honor of a walk across the room with my future wife?" he asked lightly. Olivia laughed softly, the sound carrying a happiness she had not felt in years. She placed her hand on his arm, the diamond on her finger flashing briefly beneath the chandeliers as they began to move through the crowd. Conversations parted for them like a quiet current, people stepping aside with respectful smiles. Some offered congratulations, while others simply watched with fascinated expressions. Yet at the far side of the ballroom, Ryan Caldwell remained still, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and regret. For the first time he began to realize something he had never considered before. The woman he once believed could not survive without him had not only rebuilt her life. She had built a future so strong that even the most powerful man in the room had chosen to stand beside her. The soft music from the ballroom orchestra drifted through the air like a calm river after a storm. Yet the energy in the Grand Regency ballroom had not fully settled. Guests continued to glance toward Olivia Bennet and Sebastian Cole as they moved slowly across the polished marble floor. The diamond ring on Olivia's finger caught the chandelier light with every step, scattering small flashes of brilliance that seemed almost symbolic of the moment itself. Just an hour earlier she had walked into this room quietly, unsure of how the evening would unfold. Now the entire ballroom seemed to orbit around her presence. Sebastian guided her toward a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking Manhattan's glowing skyline. Outside, the city stretched for miles beneath the night sky, thousands of lights sparkling like a reflection of the chandeliers above them. For a moment they simply stood there, together, taking in the quiet contrast between the celebration behind them and the calm view of the city beyond the glass. Olivia let out a soft breath she had not realized she was holding. "This night feels almost unreal," she admitted gently. Sebastian smiled with quiet understanding. "Most turning points in life feel that way," he said. "You rarely recognize them until you are already standing in the middle of one." Olivia glanced down at the ring again, still adjusting to the weight of it on her hand. Yet what surprised her most was not the ring itself, but the calm confidence she felt inside. For years she had imagined that moments like this belonged only to people who had never struggled, people who had always been certain of their path. Now she understood that strength often grew from the opposite journey. Across the ballroom, Ryan Caldwell remained near the same table where he had set down his glass earlier. The laughter that once surrounded him had faded completely. A few guests offered him polite nods as they passed, but most of them had shifted their attention elsewhere. His fiancée stood beside him with folded arms, her earlier excitement replaced by an expression that revealed growing discomfort. She glanced across the room toward Olivia and Sebastian, then back at Ryan, as if quietly reevaluating everything she had believed about him. Ryan tried to look composed, but the effort showed in the tight line of his jaw. He had always been a man who thrived on admiration and control. Watching the room celebrate the woman he had dismissed was a reality he had never prepared for. Meanwhile, Olivia remained unaware of the full storm of thoughts unfolding behind her. She and Sebastian had begun speaking softly about the months ahead, about the life they would build together beyond the bright lights of Manhattan society. Sebastian explained that he planned to expand his investment foundation to support small companies that were often overlooked by larger financial institutions. Olivia listened with growing interest, realizing how naturally their values aligned. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "that is exactly the type of work my consulting group specializes in." Sebastian's smile widened. "That is precisely why I knew you would understand the vision." Their conversation flowed easily, free of the tension that had once defined Olivia's life. For the first time in years, she felt as though she was standing beside someone rather than behind them. And across the room, Ryan Caldwell finally began to understand something that the rest of the ballroom had already seen clearly. The quiet woman he once underestimated had not only rebuilt her life. She had grown into someone whose strength no longer depended on anyone's approval, least of all his. The view beyond the tall ballroom windows shimmered with the endless lights of Manhattan. Yet Olivia Bennet found herself more aware of the quiet steadiness beside her than the city stretching miles into the night. Sebastian Cole stood calmly with one hand resting lightly on the marble railing near the glass, his presence carrying the same composed confidence that had filled the room earlier. The orchestra behind them continued its gentle melody, and the soft murmur of elegant conversation flowed through the ballroom like distant waves. Olivia glanced down once more at the diamond resting on her hand, still adjusting to the reality that the evening had taken such an unexpected turn. What surprised her most was not the attention from the crowd, but the quiet sense of peace she felt within herself. For years she had believed moments like this belonged only to people who had never struggled. Yet here she stood, having walked through disappointment, doubt, and loneliness, discovering that those years had shaped her into someone stronger than she had ever imagined. Sebastian noticed the thoughtful expression on her face and smiled warmly. "You are thinking about the journey that brought you here," he said gently. Olivia laughed softly, slightly amazed by how easily he read her thoughts. "It is strange," she admitted. 3 years ago, I was trying to figure out how to rebuild a life from scratch. Tonight it feels like I stepped into a completely different world." Sebastian nodded with quiet understanding. "The world did not change," he said calmly. "You did." His words lingered with a quiet truth that made Olivia smile. Across the ballroom, Ryan Caldwell remained near the same table, though the distance between him and the center of attention felt larger than the entire room. A few minutes earlier he had attempted to resume conversation with several colleagues, but the effort had not gone well. Their polite smiles carried the unmistakable tone of people who were no longer impressed. Ryan had always been skilled at controlling the narrative around him, shaping stories that made his ambition appear admirable. But tonight the narrative had slipped beyond his reach. His fiancée stood beside him in uncomfortable silence, occasionally glancing across the room at Olivia with an expression that held more curiosity than resentment. Ryan followed her gaze again and saw Olivia and Sebastian speaking easily near the windows, their calm confidence forming a quiet contrast to the tension he now felt. For the first time he realized that the woman he once believed needed him had discovered something far more powerful than approval. She had discovered independence. Back near the windows, Olivia turned slightly as several guests approached to offer congratulations. Their smiles were genuine, their words filled with admiration rather than the polite sympathy she had grown used to hearing after her divorce. One older investor shook Sebastian's hand warmly before turning to Olivia with a respectful nod. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace tonight," he said sincerely. Olivia thanked him with a quiet smile, surprised by how natural the attention now felt. When the guests moved on, Sebastian looked at her again with the same calm admiration he had shown since the moment he entered the room. "You see," he said lightly, "people respect strength when they recognize it." Olivia looked across the ballroom one more time, her eyes briefly meeting Ryan's before returning to Sebastian. The past that had once defined her now felt like a distant chapter rather than a lingering shadow. And as the music drifted through the glowing room and the skyline sparkled beyond the glass, Olivia realized something she had not fully understood until this very moment. The life she had rebuilt quietly in the years after heartbreak had not only prepared her for happiness, it had prepared her to stand confidently in a future far greater than anything she once believed possible. The gentle music continued to flow through the Grand Regency ballroom, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that no orchestra could control. What had begun as another polished Manhattan charity gala had quietly transformed into a story that everyone in the room would remember long after the evening ended. Olivia Bennet stood beside Sebastian Cole near the tall windows, the soft glow of the city skyline reflecting in the glass behind them. The diamond on her finger still caught the chandelier light with every subtle movement of her hand. Yet, Olivia found herself thinking less about the ring and more about the strange symmetry of the moment. Just a short time earlier she had stood in this same room absorbing the sting of Ryan Caldwell's words, the echo of a belief he had repeated for years. That belief no longer held any weight. Across the ballroom, Ryan remained standing near the table where he had retreated after the proposal. The once confident rhythm of his movements had slowed, replaced by the uneasy awareness that the center of attention had shifted permanently away from him. A few colleagues approached him out of courtesy, offering brief nods or quiet remarks about the surprising turn of the evening, but none of them stayed long. Their attention kept drifting back toward Olivia and Sebastian. Ryan's fiancée watched the scene with growing discomfort. The admiration she once felt for Ryan had been built on the image of a man who always appeared successful and respected. Tonight, that image had begun to crack in front of an entire room filled with powerful observers. Ryan noticed her silence and attempted to recover his composure. "It is just a dramatic moment," he said quietly, trying to sound confident. "People enjoy spectacle." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they sounded hollow. Because the crowd was not reacting to spectacle alone. They were reacting to something genuine. Meanwhile, Olivia and Sebastian had begun moving slowly through the ballroom again as more guests approached to offer congratulations. Some spoke about the boldness of the proposal, others about the unexpected elegance with which Olivia had handled the earlier tension. Each conversation carried the same underlying respect that had quietly grown around her throughout the evening. Sebastian listened with polite calm, though his attention returned to Olivia again and again as if the crowd around them mattered far less than the woman beside him. At one point, Olivia felt a familiar gaze and turned slightly. Her eyes met Ryan's across the room for a brief moment. The distance between them was only 40 feet, yet it felt like an entirely different lifetime. Ryan's expression carried something she had never seen in him before. Not anger, not pride, something closer to realization. Olivia did not feel triumph when she saw it. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of closure. The chapter that once defined her had finally reached its true ending. She turned back toward Sebastian with a calm smile, the future unfolding ahead of her with a clarity she had never known before. And as the chandeliers continued to shimmer above the ballroom, and the music drifted gently through the air, Ryan Caldwell slowly understood the final truth of the night. The woman he once believed needed him had not only proven him wrong. She had done it without ever raising her voice. The night in the Grand Regency ballroom continued to unfold with the quiet elegance of a story that no one present would ever forget. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked softly, and the orchestra played a smooth melody that floated beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers. Yet the center of gravity in the room had permanently shifted. Olivia Bennet stood beside Sebastian Cole near the middle of the ballroom now, greeting guests who approached with warm smiles and sincere congratulations. The earlier tension had transformed into admiration. People who had once known her only as Ryan Caldwell's former wife were now seeing her through an entirely different lens. Sebastian noticed the thoughtful way Olivia listened to each person who approached, never rushing the conversation, never seeking attention, yet receiving it naturally. It was the same quiet confidence that had impressed him the first day she walked into his office 2 years earlier. "You do not seem surprised by any of this," he said gently once the latest group of guests moved on. Olivia looked at him with a small smile. "I am surprised by the proposal," she admitted softly. "But not by the way life changes when you stop trying to prove something to people who already decided who you were." Sebastian nodded slowly, appreciating the quiet strength behind her words. Across the ballroom, Ryan Caldwell finally stepped away from the table where he had been standing for most of the evening. His movements were slower now, more careful, as though he were walking through a reality he had not expected to face. The distance between him and Olivia had once been filled with certainty. Now it felt like an empty space filled with unanswered questions. His fiancée remained near the table, watching him with an expression that suggested she was beginning to see him differently than before. Ryan approached the edge of the crowd where Olivia and Sebastian stood speaking with several guests. The room subtly noticed his movement. Conversations softened slightly as people sensed the possibility of another moment unfolding. Olivia turned when she felt the familiar presence nearby. Ryan stopped a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them carried the weight of years. Finally Ryan cleared his throat. "Olivia," he said quietly. It was the first time that evening he had spoken her name without sarcasm. Olivia met his gaze calmly, her posture relaxed beside Sebastian. "Ryan," she replied with equal composure. Ryan glanced briefly at the diamond ring on her hand before looking back at her. "I did not expect to see you here tonight," he admitted. Olivia's expression remained gentle but steady. "Life has a way of bringing people back into the same room," she said. The response was not bitter. It was simply honest. Ryan gave a short nod, absorbing the quiet dignity in her tone. For the first time in years he realized that the power he once believed he held over her had disappeared completely. Olivia was not standing there to prove anything to him anymore. She was simply living a life that had grown beyond his reach. Sebastian watched the exchange with calm awareness, his presence beside Olivia neither possessive nor defensive, only supportive. Ryan finally took a slow breath and stepped back slightly, understanding that the moment no longer belonged to him. And as the orchestra continued its gentle music beneath the shimmering chandeliers, the truth of the evening became impossible to ignore. Olivia Bennet had not returned to this room seeking validation. She had returned as someone who had already found it within herself. Ryan Caldwell remained standing where he had stepped back moments earlier, the soft glow of the chandeliers reflecting faintly in the glass walls behind him. The quiet dignity in Olivia Bennet's voice still lingered in his mind. For years he had been certain that their story ended the day she walked out of his penthouse apartment with nothing but a suitcase and a calm promise that she would be fine. At the time he had believed that promise was nothing more than pride. Now he realized it had been something else entirely. Across the ballroom Olivia stood beside Sebastian Cole, her posture relaxed, her expression warm as she continued greeting guests who approached with congratulations. The diamond ring on her hand caught the light each time she moved, but what truly drew people toward her was not the jewelry. It was the quiet confidence she carried with effortless grace. Sebastian noticed the way the room seemed to respond to her presence and smiled slightly. "You have a remarkable ability to make people feel comfortable," he said quietly once the nearby guests moved away. Olivia gave a small laugh. "I spent years learning how to listen," she replied. "When you spend enough time being overlooked, you begin to notice details that others miss." Sebastian nodded thoughtfully, appreciating the honesty in her words. "That is exactly why I trust your judgment," he said. Nearby, several investors were already discussing the story that would travel through the financial community by morning. The unexpected proposal had become the defining moment of the evening, but for those who paid attention, it represented something deeper. It revealed the kind of character that could quietly influence the direction of powerful decisions. Meanwhile, Ryan slowly walked toward the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, needing a moment away from the attention that no longer belonged to him. The Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a sea of lights reflecting off the Hudson River like scattered stars. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think honestly about the past. When Olivia had left their marriage, he had framed the story in a way that protected his pride. He told colleagues that she lacked ambition, that she had depended on him too much, that their separation had simply been inevitable. The narrative had been convenient. It allowed him to move forward without examining his own role in what had happened. But watching her tonight made that version of the story impossible to maintain. She had not disappeared after the divorce. She had rebuilt herself quietly, far away from the circles where his name carried influence. Ryan looked across the ballroom again and saw Olivia and Sebastian speaking together with easy familiarity. There was no tension between them, no competition for control. It was the kind of partnership he had never truly understood. As the orchestra transitioned into a slower melody, Couples began moving toward the dance floor, their reflections gliding across the polished marble. The evening was continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet everyone present knew that the story unfolding beneath those chandeliers would be remembered for years. Olivia turned slightly and noticed Ryan near the windows again. Their eyes met briefly across the room, but this time there was no weight in the moment. The past had finally loosened its grip. She turned back toward Sebastian with a calm smile as the music carried gently through the ballroom. And standing beneath the golden light, Olivia Bennet understood something that once seemed impossible. The life she had built after loss had not only restored her confidence, it had revealed a strength that no one else had the power to take away. The music drifting through the Grand Regency ballroom softened into a slow, elegant melody as more couples stepped onto the polished marble dance floor. The golden chandeliers above reflected across the room like a constellation of quiet light, and the city skyline beyond the tall windows shimmered beneath the deep blue of the Manhattan night. Olivia Bennet stood beside Sebastian Cole near the edge of the dance floor, watching the movement of the crowd with calm appreciation. The evening had transformed in ways she could not have predicted when she first stepped into the ballroom. Yet what surprised her most was not the proposal, or even the attention surrounding them now. It was the peaceful certainty she felt inside. Sebastian noticed the thoughtful look in her eyes and offered a gentle smile. "You are very quiet," he said softly. Olivia glanced down briefly at the ring on her finger before looking back up at him. "I was thinking about how strange life can be," she replied. 3 years ago, I walked away from a life that looked perfect from the outside. Tonight, I realized that leaving was the best decision I ever made." Sebastian studied her expression for a moment and nodded with understanding. "Sometimes losing the wrong path is the only way to find the right one," he said calmly. Nearby, several guests began to gather closer to the dance floor as the orchestra continued its gentle rhythm. The atmosphere in the ballroom felt lighter now, almost celebratory, as if the earlier tension had completely dissolved into something brighter. Across the room, Ryan Caldwell still stood near the tall windows overlooking the city. The reflection of the skyline shimmered faintly across the glass beside him. He had spent the past several minutes quietly observing the room, watching the way people naturally gravitated toward Olivia and Sebastian. Earlier that night, he had believed the evening belonged to him. Now he understood that it never truly had. A colleague approached Ryan briefly, offering a polite remark before excusing himself to greet another group of guests. The interaction was brief and distant, and when Ryan was alone again, he let out a slow breath. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider something he had avoided since the divorce. When Olivia left, he had assumed she would eventually return or fade quietly into a life far removed from his own. He had never imagined she would return stronger, calmer, and completely beyond his influence. Meanwhile, Olivia felt Sebastian gently extend his hand toward her. "May I have this dance?" he asked with a quiet smile. The request felt simple, yet the sincerity behind it made Olivia's heart warm. She nodded and placed her hand in his. As they stepped onto the dance floor, the orchestra's melody seemed to wrap around them like a soft current of sound. Their movements were slow and natural, guided more by shared rhythm than formal steps. Guests nearby smiled as they watched the couple glide across the floor beneath the shimmering chandeliers. It was not a performance. It was simply two people enjoying the beginning of a new chapter. Ryan noticed them dancing and felt an unexpected clarity settle over him. For years he had believed success was measured by control, recognition, and the ability to shape every situation to his advantage. Watching Olivia now revealed a different truth. The strength she carried had not been built from control at all. It had grown from resilience, patience, and the quiet courage to rebuild a life without bitterness. And standing there near the tall windows while the orchestra played and the ballroom shimmered with light, Ryan Caldwell finally understood something he had never considered before. The woman he once believed would never succeed without him had not only proven him wrong. She had done it with grace that left no room for regret.